Hello, week 2, history, welcome. Lesson 1, week 2, we're looking this week at migrant experiences. So you're going to need, go out of our OneNote, you're going to need this in front of you, history, year 6, lesson 10. Same as last week with geography, we're going to be doing 4 short half an hour, roughly, lessons. This week we are going to go through the entirety of this little booklet here and work our way through the same way that we did with geography last week. So let's have a look. We have a video to watch together and we're going to stop and have some stop and start with that, and then I'm going to go through question 1 with you. So what is the focus question in history? It says, how have migrant experiences of Australian democracy and citizenship changed since Federation? Going to examine the status and rights of migrants to Australia during the 20th century. And in this lesson, you will learn about the attitudes of Australians to certain groups of people after Federation and how this affected their experience of democracy and citizenship in Australia. So let's read through this migration paragraph here, follow along with me, and then we'll move into the video. So it says, migration, or the movement of people from one country to another, has been going on for thousands of years. Often migrants are seeking safety and protection or the opportunity for a better life in a new country, For the most part, at Federation, Australia was a nation of migrants. Have a think about what you think migrants means. We've discussed that term before. Remember, migrants, maybe refer to a glossary if we need to. The population comprised mainly of the descendants of hundreds of thousands of British migrants, so that is, people who came in, who arrived in Australia during the 18th and 19th centuries as either convicts or free settlers. Despite this, one of the first tasks of the new federal government, national government, was to craft a national immigration policy, because each of the former colonies had different immigration rules, which means laws and rules around who can come in and out of the country. The policy was a set of laws which controlled who could enter Australia and under what conditions they were allowed to stay and work. That's really important because you need to know who's coming in and out of the country at all times, essentially, so you know that we have the right people here and they're here for the right reasons, or if they're invited to come, stay, live, work and maybe move here, that they're doing it in the right way as well. So let's hook straight into the video that comes with this lesson 1, and then we have question 1 to quickly run through off the back of this. Now I may pause and ask you a question or two. We'll have a little discussion. I just want to get you thinking about that as we go. So this video is called Status and Rights of Migrants in the 20th Century Australia. Now give me a moment to open this video up. Doesn't seem to want to open, which is fantastic. Bear with me, folks.
Immigration has been a significant influence in shaping Australian society since its beginnings as a nation. Today, Australia is a proudly multicultural country, but this wasn't always the case. Let's have a look at how the status and rights of migrants in Australia changed during the 20th century. At the time of Federation in 1901, Nearly 98% of Australia's 4 million people were either of British or European descent, with small numbers of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people, and even lower numbers of migrants from China, Japan, and the Pacific Islands. However, immigration was one of the key reasons that some Australians voted for federation. They were concerned about losing out on jobs to migrant workers who were hired to work for less money than the local residents. There was also a perception that an increase in workers from non-European countries would change the dominant British culture in Australia.
We've spoken about culture in geography. In fact, we were talking about cultural diversity. Now have a think very quickly for me. In this instance, with people coming in, potentially filling jobs that other people had in place, do you think that cultural diversity was deemed to be a positive thing at this time, or was it deemed to be something that would get in the way of the existing culture that the European settlers or the English settlers had in place? I think.
After Federation, the Commonwealth Government set about establishing immigration laws which reflected the general feeling of the Australian people of British or European descent. Late in 1901, the Australian Government passed its first two major pieces of legislation. The Pacific Island Labourers Act 1901 was passed in November, stating that the recruitment of overseas labour would cease after 1903. It meant that the Australian Government had the power to deport, which means forced to leave the country, any Pacific Islander after 1906. Between 1904 and 1908, over 7,000 islanders were deported. The Act had the desired effect on jobs because by the end of this period, most of the work on sugarcane farms was done by white labourers. The few South Sea Islanders who remained in Australia after the Act came into force found it difficult to get work, and they faced severe discrimination. Next, the Australian Government passed the Immigration Restriction Act 1901. Together with the Pacific Island Labourers Act, the laws became more commonly known as the White Australia Policy. Newspapers around the time of Federation strongly opposed non-English speaking migrants, such as the Chinese, as this cartoon illustrates. The policy favoured the white-skinned immigrants from certain countries, namely Great Britain and Northern Europe, and specifically prohibited various groups of people from entering Australia, including people with infectious or contagious diseases, people with a criminal record, people deemed idiots or insane, and people with work contracts at lower wages than the Commonwealth rates, which...
Does that seem to be posing a problem to you at all? For example, who decides who's an idiot? To use that term as they used. I could understand, and we might be able to understand those with criminal convictions. Maybe they want to make sure that the right type of people, good citizens perhaps coming in, but it seems to me that some of these decisions seem to be rather tremendously unfair. I want you to have a bit of a think about what it must be like to be one of those people trying to move to Australia, maybe to start a new life, and your path to moving to this country is blocked just because you were someone who was a little bit different. I don't think we would see something like that today, or at least we'd hope not, wouldn't we?
Chinese and Japanese workers. The Immigration Restriction Act was frequently amended but remained in force until 1958. One of the key requirements under the Immigration Restriction Act was that any person who wanted to migrate to Australia had to pass an English dictation test. The dictation test was meant to be given to everyone entering Australia, but in reality, it was usually only applied based on the immigrant's race as a means of preventing them from entering the country. People who failed the test were refused entry or deported. The dictation test enabled the government to exclude any person who failed to write out a passage of 50 words in English, which could be delivered in any language chosen by the officer. In fact, it was supposed to be delivered in a language unfamiliar to the prospective immigrant to ensure he or she failed. So, for example, imagine if you were Chinese and asked to note down 50 words read aloud in German, which you can't speak, then had to translate that from German into clear written English. Of course, most people failed. In fact, the dictation test was considered so difficult that out of over 1,300 people who took the test between 1902 and 1909, only around 50 passed. After 1909, no one was successful in passing the dictation test. World War II marked an important turning point in Australia's immigration history. The conflict in the Pacific against Japan made the government rethink Australia's position in the world and its immigration policies. In 1945, the Department of Immigration was formed and the concept of populate or perish was promoted. This meant that the government wanted to increase Australia's population dramatically to help defend the vast land against attack, as well as to improve the economy. Assisted migration began after World War II, which meant that the Commonwealth Government paid most of the migrants' fare to get to Australia. There was an emphasis on attracting migrants from Britain, a group who became known as £10 POMs in line with the low cost of their fare, as well as Europeans who had been displaced during the war. Between 1945 and 1965, more than 2 million migrants came to Australia. In return, they had to stay in Australia for at least 2 years and work in whatever jobs the government gave them. After long and sometimes difficult journeys, usually by sea, once migrants arrived in Australia, their experiences of life differed greatly. Most spent some time in migrant hostels or camps where they were processed and assisted to find a home and work, or given courses in English language and the Australian way of life. Some migrants who had family members already in Australia settled into life quite quickly. Others had problems adjusting to the Australian climate and food, or experienced problems of homesickness and prejudice. Some simply found life in Australia disappointing and returned to their home countries within a few years. As the migrants poured in, they filled vacancies in factories, construction projects and heavy industry. One of the largest projects was the Snowy Mountains Hydroelectric scheme begun in 1949, where more than 100,000 people from over 30 countries worked on building dams that would generate electricity and provide water to New South Wales and Victoria. Often, skilled migrants found it hard to find work to suit their training and qualifications, and had to accept whatever work was available. Many migrant workers, especially those who did not speak English well, suffered prejudice. The White Australia policy was gradually dismantled over a period of 25 years in response to shifts in attitudes and world events. A dramatic change in the immigration policy occurred in 1966 when non-European migrants could be accepted for entry to Australia based on their skills and their ability to fit into Australian society. The official end of the Immigration Restriction Act was in 1973 when it was ruled that all migrants, regardless of their origin, were eligible for citizenship after 3 years. In 1975, another crucial event occurred. The Racial Discrimination Act 1975 was introduced, making it illegal to discriminate against someone on the basis of their race. Since then, judgments about entry to Australia are based on a migrant's work skills or business and investment links that can benefit Australia, regardless of their country of birth or ethnic background.
Do you think that that's something that might level the playing field a fair bit? Do you think it seems like a much fairer option as opposed to the White Australia policy that they had earlier in the 1900s? Which one do you think is more fair for those trying to move to Australia?
After 1975, the number of British and European immigrants declined dramatically and arrivals began to come from countries closer to Australia. Among these were waves of refugees from Indochina fleeing the end of the Vietnam War. Over 80,000 refugees arrived from Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos in the 10 years after the war, many of them having survived harrowing journeys across the ocean on overcrowded fishing boats. Since then, Australia has also accepted refugees in significant numbers from Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Afghanistan and Sudan. Australia has come a long way from government policies that restricted immigration to policies that recognise and celebrate cultural diversity. In 1996, for the first time in Australia's migration history, the number of British arrivals fell to second place behind New Zealand, followed by immigrants from India, China, and South Africa. Today, more than 1/4 of Australia's population were born overseas, and many more have one or more parents who have migrated to Australia. The contribution of migrants to Australian society, culture, and the economy has been an important factor in shaping our nation.
Have a little think to yourself very quickly about the sorts of things that you might notice just around our community. Where would you notice the influence of different cultures straight away? What would be something that might pop into your mind? I know that my dinner on a Tuesday night is something that I don't like to go without. My favourite Thai restaurant, I'm sure, is influencing cultural implementation from people from Thailand. So there are examples all over the place in our country, and that's what makes our country so vast and interesting and culturally diverse, is that we have so many people that come from so many different parts of the world, and it adds a tremendous amount. Okay, so very quickly, on the back of watching that video, you have some true or false questions to run through, and it is just up until we get to this point on our workbook. So I'm not going to run through all of these one by one, because you guys are able to work through that, and hopefully with mum and or dad or our guardian or whoever it is at home with us can work through that if you need a hand. But the question does say 1A, decide whether the following statements about the changing status and rights of migrants are true or false by ticking the appropriate box. Now, I'll read the first one with us. The information is contained within this video. Now, if you're able to download and you have this PDF, you should be able to have access to this video. If you don't, just rewind our video we just had on our YouTube link and you can watch it again if you get stuck. Immigration to Australia has been encouraged since Federation. Now, did the White Australia policy early on in Federation encourage immigration? No, in fact, it probably discouraged it, didn't it? So I would put a big F in there for false for that question. So you can work your way through. We have approximately 8 or 9 questions in there. That will be it for History Lesson 1. I know that there was a fair bit to today's video, and I know that it's probably lasted ourselves for around that 15-minute mark. So luckily we only have a short little activity to do today, and then we'll move into question 2 tomorrow.